Waking up from religious indoctrination isn't a straight line, but it's more like the Time Lords describe space-time.
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
And amongst this cacophony of loosely connected threads, there are certain points that you can look at and say, wow, that actually did have an impact on my mind, even though at the time I didn't realize it. And today I want to talk about one of those for me personally. And that was an encounter I had at a Starbucks about a house in California. So let's talk about it. Hello and welcome back to the JW Thoughts channel. My name is Wally and today we are talking about Beth Sareem. Quickly before we get into it, don't forget to drop a like on the video. It literally takes a half a second and it makes a massive difference in how the video performs in the YouTube algorithm. And consider subscribing to the channel. I had a goal of hitting 45,000 subscribers last year and I have stopped talking about it. What's the new goal? So I'd be happy if we hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of this year. So if you could check that if you are subscribed to the channel, it would be very much appreciated. And with all of that being said, let's talk about Joseph Rutherford and his little house in California known as Beth Sareem. So first, let me set the stage about where I was at in my time as a Jehovah's Witness. I had recently gone through something that was pretty shaking for me because I was on the receiving end of some absurd judgments from elders. And it's not just absurd from my perspective. There were other elders who were involved in this situation that also said this was unfair and unjust and absurd and ridiculous. Their words. So I had to take it like a real man, take it on the chin, and I was publicly reproved. For those of you that don't know what that even means, essentially it's the closest you can get to getting kicked out and shunned by your entire friends and family as you can possibly get. You'll be like soft shunned. People can still talk to you at like meetings and stuff like that. You can still go and preach and all of that good stuff. And the crime I had committed was not understanding you shouldn't have a shot of scotch followed up by shotgunning a Mike's Harder lemonade. Kids, if you don't know, don't try that. If someone says, hey, you should shotgun a Four Loko or a Mike's Harder lemonade, don't do that. It is a very bad idea and your liver won't be very happy and it'll fight back. We'll just say that. So anyway, I had this situation and I had to prove myself to all of these people that I wasn't a bad person. I wasn't this evil ne'er-do-well that was causing trouble within the congregation. So I stuck it out in the original congregation that this happened, where I was reproved. And then after all of those restrictions and everything were lifted, just a little side note here, but I was so hardcore about this that even though I was removed as a pioneer, I still put in the pioneer hours for that little 6-month period. So anyway, after everything was cool and I was like reinstated as a pioneer and all of that good stuff, I switched congregation. So I had just gotten done with the disillusionment of dealing with these elders in this very unfair way. And now I was in a brand new congregation. So when I started pioneering with this new congregation, I was on a little coffee break. And I met someone that just was like, hey, are you guys Jehovah's Witnesses? I was like, yeah. And he's like, oh, okay, well, I used to be a Jehovah's Witness myself. And I, the good little boy, soldier boy for Watchtower that I decided I would say some, elder style, put my hand on your shoulder and really say some encouraging words. And he hit me with something that I didn't expect. He asked, when I was asking him why he hadn't been around, and he just said, oh, there's a lot of things that I disagree with or I might have problems with. And I was like, oh, okay, that's understandable. And he hit me with, one of the things is Beth Sareem. Have you ever heard of that? And I said, I've never heard of that. Does it have something to do with a house though? Because, Hebrew, Bethel, I'm familiar with that. He's like, well, I don't want to like tell you anything too much or have you think this is coming from me. So just look it up yourself. Look up Beth Sarim. So I was like, okay, well, that seems pretty interesting. And so I went to the Watchtower library, and there was a reference in this book, the Jehovah's Witness Proclaimers of the of God's Kingdom. And what this is basically a history of the Watchtower organization that was made in 1995, somewhere in and around there. And it documents most of their history. It's like an 800-page deal. And on page 76 of that book, there is this paragraph that described how the Jehovah's Witnesses had built Joseph F. Rutherford, their second president, this house in California because he had a bad lung. And he had built this house for himself to spend the winter months, but it also had an interesting detail in a footnote that made the claim at the time it was believed that the faithful men of old times, such as Abraham, Joseph, and David, would be resurrected before the end of the system of things and would serve as princes in all the earth. And this is according to scripture in Psalms, and then they eventually had updated this teaching. Now, at the time, I thought, well, that's pretty weird that Abraham and David would be resurrected here and they would be princes. I've never heard of any of this, but it never really clicked or connected because what I thought about it at the time was, oh, this person's just nitpicking something. Watchtower's talking about it in one of their own books. Surely they don't have anything to hide. They aren't keeping any secrets about this. So I don't know why this person was so bent out of shape about it. But it did stick with me. It did. Every so often I would think about that encounter I had with him and why this was so important. And it wasn't till several years later that I actually really looked into it and found that actually what he was trying to tell me was that the foundation of my faith was built on something that I would consider completely wackadoo, really absurd. And if those things back then were absurd and wackadoo, could it be that my current beliefs are also absurd and wackadoo? So what is this Beth Sarim and what is the full story behind it? Let's dive into it. In that paragraph of the book that I had referenced, there was mention of an old Watchtower publication from 1939 called Salvation. And in this book, towards the end of it, they were very confident that the end of the world was coming. And this was based off of an abundance of scriptural evidence and physical facts that conclusively said that this great day was right around the corner. But with this day incoming, there was going to be a resurrection of faithful people of old before the Battle of Armageddon. And they were absolutely certain of this. And because there was going to be this resurrection of ancient people from the Bible, everyone that had read the Bible and seen the stories of Noah and Enoch and all of those characters, they needed a place to stay. So enter a San Diego, California residence that would be known as Beth Sarim or House of Princes. And in there, they specifically said that the title went to the acting president of the Watchtower Society, and it was for his use. And after he was dead, it would forever be at the disposal of those aforementioned princes on earth. And this was an act of faith that they had in preserving this house. And it was very interesting that they even said, and if and when the princes do return, and some of them occupy the property, such will be a confirmation of the faith and hope that induce the building of Beth Sarim. So this at least tells me that there was a lot of people at the time, current Bible students, Jehovah's Witnesses, that were curious about this house that was built in San Diego, California. You know, people asking questions that they mentioned it specifically in their book. And this was an act of faith, essentially. It was an act of faith that if and when these people occupy this, it will be the proof that this wasn't just a mansion built for the acting president. But because Noah and Enoch never showed up and were like, hey, where's my wing of this house? it looks like it was exactly what people were suspecting. A very nice house that was built for the president of the society. Now, this, or that book that I mentioned previously, the history book, it also mentioned a Golden Age article that had the title, the legal title, and it was printed in there. And what that has to say is pretty fascinating. Now, this comes from the Golden Age, March 19th, 1930, and it's entitled The Truth About the San Diego House, and it's written by Robert J. Martin. Now, Robert J. Martin was a close associate of Joseph Rutherford, and he was a cabinet member, if you will, to his presidency as the head of Watchtower. So much so that he even served time in prison when the leadership of the Watchtower Society was sent to jail for espionage and, I believe, refusing military service. So this is a crony, a very loyal supporter of Rutherford. So you have to really take what he says with a grain of salt, and his bias really comes to the front of your mind when you look at his opening words, and the view of the fact that there are so many slanderous reports circulated about Brother Rutherford, the real purpose of which is to injure the Lord's work. Clearly, this person is pretty biased, but it is another indication that there were people talking about Rutherford and his potential mismanagement of Watchtower funds. And his presentation of events make it seem as if Rutherford had no interest in this house being built. He was just a hard-working man trying to do the Lord's cause. In fact, he said, to my personal knowledge, there is no man in America that does more real hard work daily than he. Yeah, this guy was a real sycophant. And they were talking about the impracticality of always having to rent a house for a few months, and then after, refusing for so long, he finally consented to this house being built. And then he goes and mentions that there is a deed which he is going to publish publicly because it is part of public record. And he says that there is no other deed to any piece of property like it under the sun. And boy howdy hey, he sure was correct about that one. So what does this deed say? After getting through some legal stuff, where he says, yep, here's your new home for the sum total of $10. We get into the real meat and potatoes of why they said that this house was built. And it was that the governing power and authority will be invisible to men, but that kingdom of God will have visible representatives on the earth who will have charge of the affairs of the nations under the supervision of the invisible ruler Christ, that among those who will thus be the faithful representatives and visible governors of the world will be David, who was once king over Israel, and Gideon, and Barak, and Samson, and Jephthah, and Joseph, formerly the ruler of Egypt, and Samuel, the prophet, and other faithful men who were named with approval in the Bible at Hebrews, the 11th chapter. The condition herein is that the said Watchtower Bible and Tract Society shall hold said title perpetually in trust for the use of any or all of the men above named as representatives of God's kingdom on earth, and that such men shall have possession and use of said property herein above described as they may deem for the best interest for the work in which they are engaged. So why would this even be a big deal to a believing Jehovah's Witness? Well, it's because they don't really understand their history. When I initially had read from that green book, they made it seem as if, oh, well, we used to think that people would be resurrected before Armageddon, and then we had a change in 1950 saying that these ancient people would be resurrected after Armageddon. So it's all good. And that is how Jehovah's Witnesses essentially rewrite their history. It takes away the embarrassment of a false prediction. It takes away the embarrassment of them making these bold, public announcements with surety and evidence and absolute certainty that this is going to happen as they say it will, only for that thing to completely flop and fail. So it's about how they rewrite their history so it doesn't seem so ridiculous. And when I did eventually wake up from my religious indoctrination, I thought I would put this to the test. it was something that stuck with me. It no doubt was a very specific point that I could identify where, that made a bit of a crack in my faith. I was curious if it would do the same thing for others. And so when I was awake, but still carrying on with the old Jehovah's Witness shuffle and doing my special metropolitan witnessing shift, you got nothing but time on your hands. If you are standing next to a cart, not talking to anyone, you have infinite time to just yap with the people that you're working with. And so one of the people I was with was this very loyal guy. He was served in Bethel for a long time, an elder, a pioneer, still single. You know the vibes here. And I can't remember exactly what we were talking about, but it was related to some of the finances with the Metropolitan Witness Program. If you've never been involved with that, the finances and like the amount of money that was dedicated to those projects was kind of a lot. And it seemed very weird. Like, okay, you're just having people stand next to these carts that aren't that expensive. Why is the budget for these projects so freaking high? It's like a modern day movie. You're like, does this really have a $380 million budget? And it looks like this garp? It's kind of like that. So we were talking about that, and I just casually had mentioned, well, I suppose it might be a lot like when people were asking questions about Beth Sarim. And he looked at me and said, what are you talking about? What's Beth Sarim? And I was like, oh, well, it's in the old JV book where Joseph Rutherford had built a house in San Diego, California, so that way he could chop it up with David and Enoch and Samson. Maybe give Samson a haircut. Who knows what they're going to be getting into with being a little California sober. I can't even remember what I said. Something silly and goofy like that. And the look on his face was, if you've ever like said something like this to a Jehovah's Witness and you see this, like their whole world like crumbles, they go nuclear, and then the shield pops up and he was like, what? Like, that can't be, that's not real. And I was like, yeah, that's super real. He's like, there's no way. He said, there is no way that is real. You've got something wrong. I'm like, no, you can look this up. It's in the old book, and it even has references that you can look up for yourself. And I just left it at that. I think it was one of the last times that I've ever spoken to this individual, so I don't know if it had any impact on him, but I know for me, it certainly did. And this whole controversy surrounding Beth Sarim really highlights a problem with the foundation of the Jehovah's Witness belief system and power structure at its core. Because what it highlights is that even during the time this could be controversial, there could be people writing in and saying, what's going on about this, to the point where one of his lackeys, his sycophant, licking his boots, has to write this article saying the truth about the house in San Diego. And he can say whatever he wants because it ultimately doesn't matter. People have to buy it. And if you don't, you are the one that's kicked out and removed for not buying what they tell you. And if the thing that they tell you doesn't come true, or they change it in the future, that also doesn't matter, because they can rewrite their history, they can whitewash their history to make anything seem like it really wasn't that bad. Think about every Watchtower controversy you've ever heard of. The failed prediction of 1914, the failed prediction of 1918, the failed prediction of 1925, the failed prediction of 1975, the reversals of blood doctrines, the reversals of organ transplants. Whatever the controversy, whatever the scandal that they get themselves involved with, it doesn't matter, because they control the narrative. So the important takeaway is, if someone is so stringently and obviously controlling the narrative to say whatever they want, and someone can come after them and change that and make it seem like what they said wasn't even what they said, the people that follow them will always be in the dark. It doesn't matter. You can have new governing body. You could have no governing body. You could have one president. All of it is immaterial because people have to follow what comes down the power line here, the power pyramid. And they don't have any recourse for objecting to it, for questioning it, or deciding for themselves. So that is what I think Beth Sarim really highlights. Is it was a controversy at the time, and it's a controversy later, but to a Jehovah's Witness, it ultimately doesn't matter because they never get the full story. And that's why YouTube channels like this exist. I suppose it's to tell you guys the true story. So with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching. If you're still around, don't forget to drop that like on the video if you're on mobile. Hype it, because hyping things is better than not hyping them. Would you rather be hype or not hype? How many times can I say the word hype in 7 seconds? Who knows? With all of that being said, stay safe, be kind, and don't forget to spend more time loving the things you love than hating the things you hate. Now go out there and have a hype-ass day.